Hey class, we're going to get started with our next lecture, which is lecture 7, Measures of Fitness. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can get started with the material. So with this lecture, we're going over lots of different terms that will help us classify fitness in the health-related category and a skill-related category. We're going to also kind of understand the importance of each component and how it's related to sport, as well as how can we train for each of these different measures or variables. So first we have our definition of health-related fitness. You can read that right there. And it's usually just talking about the organ's abilities to coordinate and produce a response that allows us to exercise at a certain level, have a high exercise capacity, or just be physically fit. So cardiorespiratory endurance, muscular strength, endurance, flexibility, and body comp. Each of these have kind of their own slide or a few slides are shared. And so we're going to go into each of those. So first is cardiorespiratory endurance. This is the ability of the lungs and heart to work together to deliver oxygen to our muscles. Our muscles will use oxygen to make energy, and that energy that we get is what fuels our exercise. Cardiorespiratory fitness usually determines how fit somebody is. And so we can measure it in several different ways. The best way is doing a VO2 max test, which is volume of oxygen consumed at maximal exercise. This basically tells us how well the body is able to use oxygen, the muscles and the cells to absorb it to make ATP. At rest, our VO2 is 3.5 milliliters of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body weight per minute. So there's lots of different calculations that we can do to determine someone's exercise at like submaximal versus maximal. This is some calculations that you'll do probably in your exercise testing and prescription classes or applied exercise physiology classes. But here we're just kind of looking at the basic part of it. With VO2 max, we can measure it directly or indirectly. When we measure it indirectly, it's usually through some sort of like fitness calculator. A lot of our smartwatches can predict our VO2 max based on like a workout that we did. And so there's lots of different indirect measures, but if we wanted to directly measure it, we would use this picture at the bottom. This is a metabolic cart where we would exercise at either sub, maximal, or all the way up to maximal intensity. And a gas mask would measure how much oxygen we're producing and how much CO2 we're producing and oxygen our body is consuming to use for exercise. There's other ways we can measure it. There's like this beep test or the bleep test where you are running back and forth and trying to arrive at the line before the beep. The time that you like get kicked out of the test basically can predict your VO2. There's step tests, there's 1 mile walks, jogs, 12-minute walk tests. So there's lots of different ways that we can measure it, but just all of those are estimated. They're indirect measures. And when we get a direct measure, that's obviously the most accurate. Now we're looking at the difference between muscular strength and muscular endurance. So with muscular strength, we're just trying to produce as much force as possible. It doesn't matter how quickly we're able to produce that force. Like we can produce this force like really slowly or push a really heavy object. So speed is not a factor when determining someone's maximal strength. Usually maximal strength, like getting an absolute value is like a 1 RM value, like how heavy can you lift on back squat or bench press. And so it's just how much force can you produce against a resistance? Muscular endurance is the ability of the muscle to contract over time against a submaximal force until you hit fatigue or till you burn out and can't produce anymore or produce any more force. So the best way to measure muscular endurance is by doing like how many push-ups can you do in a minute? Or how many sit-ups can you do? There's some other measures as well for more advanced populations, but those are kind of the easiest ones to do. Using your body as the submaximal resistance and then producing repetitions until you fatigue out. Is one more important than the other? It really depends on like your goals and what sports you play and kind of what fitness outcome that you're desiring. Whether that's just to be strong and if you have to produce a lot of force, maybe in your everyday life, or if you just have to have a lot of muscular endurance, maybe holding on to heavy objects for long periods of time or carrying kids around, or just constantly producing some maximal contractions. Next is body composition. Body comp, we're just looking at percent of the body fat we have as compared to our lean body mass. This is more indicative of health rather than fitness, but some sports do require very lean physiques for success, such as being like a long distance runner or somebody who competes in like aesthetic competitions like gymnastics or dance, where body fat may actually need to be lower for success. Um, but like I said, it's most indicative of health. There are different types of fat we have in our body. We have subcutaneous fat under the skin, visceral fat surrounding our internal organs, and then intermuscular fat. We can measure body fat in several different ways by getting like a percent measure through skin fold calipers or bioelectrical impedances. We can get circumference measures to look at girth, and then look at hip to waist ratio, which can help to determine if someone is predisposed to like cardiovascular health or like events, adverse cardiovascular health. BMI is interesting because BMI is a very common measure, but there are several disadvantages to BMI, but it's still very widely used, especially when we go to physicians' offices to assess health. It says 1 in 4 are miscalculated. It's only 25% of the population is probably given an inaccurate result. It's not accurate if you're very muscular, very short, very tall, elderly and frail, who have less muscle mass, somebody who's pregnant, or a growing child. Because it can't distinguish between body fat and lean mass. So it just looks at weight compared relative to your height. This is the equation over here. If you're interested in figuring out what your BMI is, you can use this equation that you see here on the slide. And then once you get that number, you can see where you fall into the chart. And so I'll use my husband, for example. He is 6'2". So we come over here on the height side to go 6'2", and then we go all the way over. He's a little over 200 pounds, which puts his BMI at like 26, which in the yellow is the overweight category. But my husband is not overweight. He's just tall and he's muscular. And so it miscategorizes him into this overweight section where he is not overweight. And so that's where the issue comes in with using BMI. So let's talk about flexibility. Flexibility is important for health, but it can be important in some sports depending on the area. And so we look over here at what are our most common places for measurement. Shoulder flexibility. So any athlete who goes through a full range of motion at the shoulder joint, so shoulder rotation or throwing sports. Low back flexibility and hamstring flexibility. Low back, the lumbar region is usually a tighter region in individuals, and especially as well as our hamstrings are very tight. And so let's think what sports need flexibility to be successful. We can go back to what we said earlier about gymnasts, dancers need to go through large range of motions. And then you think of somebody who's pitching or throwing, they need flexibility at the shoulder. You think somebody who's weightlifting, they need like low back flexibility, probably some shoulder flexibility. A lot of sports need hamstring flexibility, especially if they're kicking sports or running sports. Tight hamstrings can limit our mobility and our performance. And so that we want to be able to stretch our muscles and go through that range of motion. But the next question is, what happens if muscles are stretched too much? There is such thing as overstretching a muscle. Number one, it can cause injury because the muscle is so stretched out that it can't contract in a timely manner when needed during a sport. And it can also just reduce performance because like the recoil of the muscle is not quick enough because the fibers are so stretched out and the signal to activate the muscle tissue has to now travel further. And so we have like this delayed power response as well. And so, like I said, injury can occur because the muscle is so loose and your performance may go down. All right, now we're on skill related fitness. Skill related is more about actual sports or just skills that we're performing rather than health. Like we looked at the health related fitness, it was a lot about health, but it was also, we could also relate it to certain sports. So here, we'll look at speed, agility, balance, coordination, reaction time, and power. And we'll talk about how having a high level of one or all of these can make you very efficient and effective in your sports. All right, so first we have speed and agility. The definition of speed is quickly perform a movement, like how quickly can you swing a golf club or a racket, but also how quickly can you move your body. And so we think of sprinting usually when we think of speed. Agility is ability to change directions rapidly and accurately. Think of like cutting drills, sports that involve cutting, pivoting, anything where we have like quick feet. So we think what sports need agility? This answer is pretty easy. It's any sport usually that is on a court, like basketball or volleyball. And then we think of sports that are on a field, like soccer or baseball or football. What else plays a role in agility and being able to do it well? I say reaction time. You have to be able to respond to a stimulus quickly in order to change your direction or change your movement pattern. And there are some other things that play a role in agility. Like obviously you need to be flexible to be able to move quickly and rapidly in response. You probably also need good balance and coordination. And so we'll look at that in a second. So here's balance and stability. We know balance, maintaining equilibrium, stationary or moving, and stability is usually your ability to return to equilibrium after you've been offset, so after you've been unbalanced. We know that not all athletes require like a high level of balance, but some sports that do, or those different movements that do, is really necessary to execute your skill perfectly, and then also to prevent injury. And so balance can come from anything where we maybe have to move to one foot, like standing on one foot to either kick a soccer ball or lunge to get a tennis ball. We also know balance plays a role in all of gymnastics routines. We know that it can also be like if we're cycling and we have to move to like the side of our bike and like right on the edge as we're turning around a corner. So the ability to control the forces of your body and the bike as you're moving is also characteristic of balance. So there's lots of different things we think about with just being able to balance and be stable. Coordination also kind of plays into this, but we can think of coordination more so as performing motor tasks, like a fine motor skill smoothly, accurately. And so coordination can be anything from grabbing a baton to hand-eye, like so with hand-eye coordination, could be to like foot-eye coordination, kicking a soccer ball or walking across like a beam, which has balance in mind. But if we're also trying to move, there's like a coordination part of it as well. And so what sports use coordinated movements the most? What about non-sport activities? And then do you think hand-eye or foot-eye coordination is harder to be successful at? And so kind of thinking about coordination and balance and just like everyday activities. Think about coordinated responses with like finger dexterity, like how well can you use your fingers to do a movement pattern? How well can you move your body accurately to do like a fine a movement? Hand eye versus foot eye, I honestly think it's what you grew up practicing the most. Some people say hand eye is harder because sometimes you may be moving your feet and also have to coordinate your hand movement. Foot-eye coordination, you have to like look at something and your feet, like if you're running and dribbling a soccer ball. So again, I think it's really just kind of what you practice the most and grew up doing. For me, I think I have better foot-eye coordination, but only because I played soccer for longer than I played softball. And so that's why I think I'm more successful at that. But yeah, for everybody, I think it's actually different. Reaction time, how quickly can you respond to a stimulus? This is measured in milliseconds, and it has to do with the processing of the central and peripheral nervous system working together to coordinate a response perfectly. Um, I have very poor reaction time. But I find this question interesting is responding to auditory signals versus visual signals. So if you're hearing like a whistle blow or a gun go off, like processing this auditory signal to produce movement, or do we see a visual stimuli such as like a flag being waved? And that's our response to move. Um, so again, I also think it's possibly what your sport had to do most of and what you practice the most because we can train reaction time. We can practice drills to like move quickly to a stimulus. If you've ever seen like a board where certain colors light up and you have to like hit the color quickly and move your body to hit the color, that's how quickly can you respond to that signal lighting up. So maybe that was a visual signal, or you could hear a signal and have to respond to the auditory sound. And so I think this is really important in sports because whistles, signals happen all the time, especially in sports that have to move their body quickly, like speed or power or reaction. And then I think our last one here is power. So power is a combination of both strength and speed or force and velocity. And so ability to produce force rapidly, but we have to have some sort of like submaximal resistance and we have to move that resistance as quickly as possible. So some people argue this is the most important aspect in like sports and fitness, and I actually agree because we produce power in sports more so than we produce maximal strength. Most of the time, we're doing movements quickly against a submaximal resistance rather than moving like the heaviest weight possible or like contracting all your muscles at once. Um, and so we look how do we measure this? And one of the best ways for advanced lifter or advanced athletes is doing a Olympic lift, such as a 1RM on snatch or clean and jerk, or an Olympic derivative, such as doing a power clean. There's also ways that we can measure by um, doing there's like a stair test where you run up the stairs as fast as possible and it like calculates how quickly your movement was and how high the steps were. So there's lots of different ways we can calculate this. We can also train for power along what we call this force velocity curve. We see power over here is right in the middle because it takes a moderate amount of force, and usually that force is produced at moderate velocities. We see speed over here at the very bottom and the maximal strength up at the top. But we should train throughout this entire curve, doing heavy strength work, doing really fast contractions, and then also doing some power work as well. So that's all for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed learning about these different measures of fitness, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, great.